Welcome to episode 2 of the Ideal Spaces podcast, a series of 10 vignettes in which we discuss the driving forces behind society as it is today. Not only the built architectural world we live in, but also the human processes of social imagination that architecture is an expression of. I'm your host, Flora Lockridge, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined by the founder of Ideal Spaces Working Group, Ulrich Gehmann, and New Developments and Digital Design Lead, Michael Johansson. We're delighted to welcome Professor Kean Birch onto today's podcast, who'll be participating in our discussion of the topic, managed spaces. Kean Birch is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, as well as Graduate Programme Director of the Science and Technology Studies Programme at York University, Canada. His research focuses on the emergence of a specifically technoscientific capitalism, entailing the increasing entanglement of technoscience and finance. His most recent project focuses on the diverse modes of rentiership in technology sectors, especially in the extraction and exploitation of our personal data, and what this means for the organisation of markets and economies. So before we begin our discussion, Ulrich, could you maybe give us a brief outline of the topic managed spaces? What exactly are they, and what do you understand by management more broadly?
When we speak about managed spaces, first of all, of course, it has to be clarified what is management. In its broadest terms, it's a set of techniques applied to coordinate people towards reaching certain predefined goals. As a technique, management is also an art, namely the art of a directed, intended influence and control to reach certain ends, means goals. This influence can be very, very broad-based, also including the motivation of people, also including indirect measures of payments and so on. But finally, people should be brought to work in common to reach certain ends. This is the most common denominator. And even if we refrain from setting explicit and conscious goals, it needs management to keep a certain planned, constructed order running. For instance, in the management of an entire state with its many organs, or the management of a city. In these cases, there are also goals, namely to keep the overall organization intact and viable, without having been explicitly formulated. These final goals, in any case, no matter if made explicit or not, are broken down into sub-goals, in targets and objectives. Here, the formatization and algorithmization owing to management comes into play. The architecture of diverse processes cast into an overall organizational structure. This is the respective managed space. In their broad, encompassing sense, these spaces are architectures of organization, designed and maintained to reach goals via planned and deliberately influencing people to reach them. And managed spaces relate thus to the notion of the functional space, our next podcast episode, and of course to the spaces, the architectures of organization. Any space of organization is both the result and the subject of management. It needs management to build it up and to sustain and maintain it afterwards. I think in most general terms, this is about management and managed spaces, to conceive them as a kind of, the managed spaces, as a kind of organizational architecture.
And I know, Michael, you've come up with a very interesting metaphor of a map to describe managed spaces. I wonder if you can maybe say a bit more about that.
When we planned this episode, I talked about different metaphors concerning ideas of practically managing something. How to tame a small river, to change its direction, and to control how the water runs based on an intention or idea. Or what happens with a map that is supposed to direct you to a certain place and the terrain has no resemblance with what was expressed in that map?
Mm-hmm. I think it's such an interesting way of thinking about how spaces are organised and managed. And speaking of maps, one of Kean's research interests is the entanglement of space with financial logic and how this plays out in cities and landscapes, and of course society more broadly. So perhaps, Kean, you could speak a bit more about your interest in this relationship between space and finance.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast as well. So I think there's two kind of examples that I can draw on from my research that I've done in the past, and it links into what Ulrich was saying about this management of how the management plays out through the formatting of organizations and the kind of algorithmic kind of understanding of organizations and so on. And coincidentally, what makes this really interesting for me right now, this understanding this kind of management space, is that I've started reading James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State, which I should have read probably years ago, but it's discussion of how various social actors in this state, in this example, the state itself, deploy certain measurement techniques and tools, certain kinds of logics, and the kind of management techniques that Ulrich was talking about, in order to construct these landscapes, or social scapes as well, you could call them. And so when it comes to what I've been thinking about, trying to think about, what are the management tools in finance? What are the logics in finance? What are the kind of management practices in finance? You can see the way that these get these kind of start to contour the landscape or format the landscapes in which they are deployed. And I think two kind of examples of this, as I mentioned, are ones that I'm interested in are firstly in relation to the development and production, cultivation, and then deployment of advanced biofuels. So primarily liquid biofuels. So these kinds of biofuels that are meant to supplement or even replace fossil fuels. And then the second one is around housing, individual personal housing, and the transformation of that from being a home, as it were, into being an asset. And I think these two examples are good, provide a number of ways to think about this kind of deployment of these measurement tools, logics, management practice, and so on, and how they end up transforming landscapes. So on the one hand, if we think about biofuels, my work is primarily focused on Ontario, and you can think about biofuels in Ontario, specifically in relation to the development of biofuels from forestry resources. And we can think about the ways that the understanding of these resources, these kind of timber resources and other kinds of forestry resources, are configured by these kinds of understanding of forests as financial objects, and this is a long-standing interest, and it comes out in the book Seeing Like a State that I mentioned, where this is one of the first instances that James C. Scott notes of the role of of measurement and so on in transforming landscapes. So here in Ontario, forests are they're a natural resource, they're a natural asset, and they are managed as such, and they're managed as a natural asset, and the management of them involves the transformation of the landscape through things like building the provincial government building roads, access roads for loggers to go in and cut down trees and so forth. But they're also the management practices are also involved in understanding how to deal with the real diversity in the forests themselves. So wood is really complex, and once you start breaking it down, in a very literal sense, actually, you start cutting down trees, you start cutting the timber up, you realize that you have an enormous number of products, as it were, coming out of these forests, and how you deal with them entails an understanding of their kind of financial worth. So when it comes to something like biofuels, biofuels don't work financially, economically, unless they are derived from what is seen as waste materials. So advanced biofuels just aren't economical unless they are derived from waste materials. So you automatically have a situation in which the developers and others who are trying to promote biofuels production depend upon other kinds of industries to cut down trees, make timber, turn them into products, and then the offcuts, the sawdust, the other kinds of waste materials. That's what that kind of free material, if you like, characterized as a free material, the residues, is the natural resource that the biofuels developers are reliant upon. And so once you understand those materials as being this kind of free waste residue, you have this. You then have to understand how to manage it, the management practices you need, and the kind of, you can sort of see the logics at play when it comes to understanding this as a kind of attached sector, if you like. It's a kind of, well, not tax, symbiotic sector, if you like. So it doesn't operate by itself. It's always operating in relation to other kinds of sectors. That's a very specific example. The other example is a bit more generic, and that's around housing. So we can understand, look at housing and the transformation of housing over the last, I would say, probably since the mid to late 1990s. And since then, housing in countries like Canada, plus also I think other Anglo-American countries, so the UK, America, Australia, New Zealand, the housing has been transformed from being, what we might think of as our, this is our home, to being transformed into an asset, in particular, a financial asset. And so that's not to say that housing was not something that was a capitalist object that was managed, in capitalism as a kind of commodity. We can think of, housing as being, has been for a long time, the exemplar of private property. It's an object that is sold, and you can think of that as maybe an example of a kind of commoditized space. But it's been transformed into this more kind of what I would say is a kind of assetized space, right, over the last 20, 25 years. And you can see this play out most recently, and I find this kind of interesting right now in the Toronto context and in the Canadian context, and maybe other contexts. I'm not sure about Germany, but I think this is happening in other places like the UK. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, and this global pandemic, which we might expect to disrupt, the financial value and the financial logics at play when it comes to things like housing, has done nothing of the sort. In fact, we've seen in the Toronto context or the Canadian context, I think we see housing prices have risen 10%, 11%, from last year. So the pandemic is actually, in some senses, it's actually potentially accelerating the financialization or the transformation of housing into an asset. And this it's tied into this shift in our thinking away from housing being a house or even being a commodity, something that we sell, that we make to be sold. We shift away from that to it being something that is that we are understand as a financial investment on which we expect to receive a return over a certain period of time when we sell it or what have you. So there's this really interesting disjuncture that's going on, in which there's a lot of debate in the Canadian context, at least in the Toronto context, there's a lot of debate about the need for affordable housing, but at the same time, the fact that housing is now this financial asset that reacts and responds to all sorts of financial pressures and logics that are driven not by the needs of people in their cityscapes or whatever we want to call them. They're not driven by the needs of people to have a place to live. They're driven by very different pressures, and the primary one, I think, is at least in the Toronto context, the primary one is basically interest rates. So house prices, as interest rates go down, house prices go up, and this is a fairly this has been discussed by researchers at the Bank of England, at the Bank for International Settlement, and so on. That this is one of the kind of weird financial logics at play. That well, it's not a weird financial logic actually, because it's about the cost of money. So as the cost of money goes down, interest rates going down, that means it's easier to borrow money, and that means it's we have more money to spend on buying and investing in assets, and that means that asset prices are pushed upwards. And so with this transformation of housing into an asset, you end up with what I think of as it's the result of what I think of as a kind of low interest rate regime. And this is deeply problematic in various countries, because we're in a situation in which I don't see interest rates rising anytime soon. And you can't increase the supply of housing to decrease the cost, the prices of housing. So it's no longer about housing being commoditized and being sold, because that doesn't matter almost anymore. So there's this real issue with this, what I think of this kind of assetization here. But I'll stop there and then come back to it.
My overall impression about that, what Kean sketched out in these two examples, was there is in the first phase, the emergence of a parallel space to the real space, a space based on pure abstraction. And then over time, which exists in parallel to the space of real humans in real spaces. And then over time, this abstract space is taking command and control over the real space. And this, as Kean had it, and this, of course, will affect humans. When we speak about, to come back to traditional terms, when we speak about human conditions as a conditio humana, this will change the conditio humana. It will change people, their habits, their perception of the world, and so on. And this is a very interesting process, how an abstraction can generate complete new realities.
Yeah, I think that it's a very, this whole idea of the transformation of us as humans is very interesting to think. That's really key to human life in many ways. How are we transformed? But I think that the abstraction, I think that sometimes there's a tendency to think about finance and financialization as a process as being something that happens outside of the real economy in the real world. And I think that sometimes obscures the very real everyday activities, practices, measurement tools, management, all these things that we're talking about when it comes to managed space. This transformation of people. It's if we're accepting that that the financial ideas and logics and so on, these abstractions are changing people, then they become very real. And we can see this becoming very real in the in the specific case of something like housing, where there is for people, housing is very much built around nowadays built around understanding it as this, this important asset. And this is not only transformative at the individual level, but it's transformative at the societal level, because it has significant implications for how we go about managing things like, welfare. How do we manage welfare? How do we manage, how do we manage expectations about the future? How do we manage even something as simple as how do we manage the education, schooling of children? We could think of something like the impacts. I'm not sure if this happens in Germany, but it certainly happens in the UK and Canada, where if your house is located within a school catchment area, that actually has an impact on the value of your house. And so there's all these sorts of ways that these what seem to be financial abstract kind of logics, managements, measurements, and so on play out in very real everyday settings.
This connection to the very real. As I experienced it in the case of Lisbon, where during a time of only 4 years, the entire inner city became gentrified even more. There were empty houses, perfectly restored, historically correct restored, and these houses were empty. They were just simple financial assets for some people, and if there was a real housing, if in these cases, there were people who lived for 2 weeks in a year in this house, and all the entire normal population we met in the beginning when we visited Lisbon, as all these small shops, etc., they disappeared.
And this is why the issue of housing, going back to that notion of going back to that idea that to solve their housing problems or issues, all we need is extra supply, doesn't work, because if you have a situation in which the people who already have the housing assets and own housing assets, and this is just average people. We're not talking about the top 1%. We're talking about people who own houses, and that in Canada, that's 65%. 65% of households are homeowners. So just talking about 2/3 of the population, these people have the housing assets to leverage to purchase more housing assets, and as the value of their houses go up, they have more power to shape and manage space, and this is problematic, or deeply problematic, I would say, from a governance standpoint, because as any government simply cannot do anything about this process or this logic, because they cannot come in on a political platform which says we are going to devalue your house prices. No one's going to vote for them. So you have a deeply problematic political situation in which no one can actually resolve this. And I think I just don't see a way to get out of this without some form of financial crash again.
Yeah. Which is a very interesting connotation as regards the classical understanding of management. Management is aligned to the rise of civilization, is aligned to the rise of the idea of the state, and now this prototype of management, the state, the government, is no longer able to interfere in processes which are of crucial importance for its citizens.
Well, I think there might be a question of the difference between the state and the government, and I think that's a question of politics, and it's a question of how do you politically make the case for doing something that has an impact on the future livelihoods of citizens. And maybe I'm being too pessimistic. Maybe there are ways of doing it in which you shift the expectation of financial benefits away from housing to something else. And that would be one way of thinking about trying to do it, so that you're, in a kind of managerial perspective, you're trying to shift people's expectations of where they should, what they should benefit from house price rises to, it could be, investments in high tech startups, and you just need to manage the, if you can manage the that flow of finance from one to the other over time, and maybe you could shift it gradually over a period of time.
Yes, and what strikes me, and it's something you've both mentioned, is that there's this incredibly close link between the financial, political, but also the social impact of housing. And as you say, Kean, it's this constant balancing act. If you alter one variable like house price, it of course has a real knock-on effect on the lives of the people who inhabit and depend, of course, on these homes. And what I think is very interesting here, and perhaps problematic, is if we think about the value of the house versus the value of the home, which for me has connotations of the social aspect and comfort of housing rather than the purely financial aspects. I mean, a lot of people now during this pandemic are being asked to stay at home. And I wondered what you make of the difference between the house and the home, both assets, but perhaps of a different type.
Yeah, so we could expand the notion of the asset and take out the financial from it, and think of what is a social asset, and think about where how do we understand the things, that the infrastructure, the institutions, and so on that underpin our societies, and that we can manage and reconfigure in ways that that achieve certain goals that we have collectively decided upon. And you could think of these things, a home, as being a social asset. It's a place that is different from work. It is a place that's different from public space. All these sorts of things that that maybe we have an understanding of a role that is not simply a financial moneymaker.
Yes, exactly. And I suppose management is performed in very different ways, but then they're so closely linked, this idea of kind of the social and then the financial, which is really interesting. And there's this reciprocal relationship that's coming up so often in our discussion, the idea that people, also create spaces, but equally spaces mold people. And I find, or what I find really interesting, is how the recently prevalent global neoliberal mindset came about, and how, as Ulrich was talking about, how it's formed the underlying concept of the individual, and for example, how these basic assumptions we hold about a preferred or ideal human condition have come about. And Kean, I wondered how this plays out, in your opinion, in terms of abstract or digital ways of creating niche markets or preferences.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that there's lots of interesting connections and relationships between the rise of what we can call neoliberalism. Now, I struggle with the term neoliberalism, but I think that's probably another. That's for another discussion. But I think that what's interesting about neoliberalism is neoliberalism emerges as almost a direct challenge to managerial capitalism. So when you think about the history of capitalism, generally there's a kind of you start with mercantilism, which moves into laissez-faire capitalism in the 19th century with the expansion of the British Empire. And then at the end of the 19th century, you have the emergence of the USA, and especially the rise of large corporations, and then this kind of establishment of managerial capitalism, corporate executives and managers running capitalism, basically. And then you have the breakdown of that managerial capitalism in the 1970s, with the ideas, these kind of neoliberal ideas that actually, managerial capitalism has failed, and you have the crisis of the 1970s, as the kind of stimulus catalyst for the idea that managerial capitalism has failed, and that you need to replace it with something that is you need to replace it essentially with a more kind of market-based version of capitalism, and so you need to find you need to ensure that the market is the primary organizing mechanism for managing the economy, and that then spreads to the notion that the market should be the primary organizing mechanism for managing society. And so this is kind of the framing of this emergence of capitalism. And what's really interesting about some of this is that actually you have these ideas, this idea that markets should replace managerial capitalism and managers, and this is the kind of the leading neoliberal lights like Hayek, Friedman, people like that. But what you end up with, I think, with neoliberalism is you end up with a version of you end up with another version of managerialism or managerial capitalism, which comes out of the ideas that get developed in the kind of legal realm, especially by people like Richard Posner, who was one of the key drivers of the law and economics movement. And there's a great book by Sonia Amadei called Prisoners of Reason, in which he talks about the role of Richard Posner in this development of neoliberalism, and pointing out that with Richard Posner, his argument is that everything is already a market. So actually, it's not about extending the market. We just have to think about everything as a market anyway. And once we think about everything as a market, actually, we can just start making decisions as if everything is a market, and we don't actually have to have the market operate. We just have to think that everything is a market, and then we can manage it, make decisions as if it is a market. And that means that we can actually design and manage markets. And by designing and managing markets, we can achieve the goals that we want without actually relying upon the market mechanism itself. And so this is where I took this idea and started thinking about how does this relate to digital capitalism? And you can start thinking about this. Digital capitalism is based upon, in my view, the automation and the automating of markets and market mechanisms. And so this automation transforms markets from being a spontaneous order of the kind of Hayekian view into being a very organized and managed markets. And you can do this increasingly, as you collect more and more data, you create various digital platforms, you create enclaves, you create these kind of enclaves in which economic activity is happening. You can think of something like Amazon, for example, or Facebook as being these enclaves in which people are operating. So what you're actually doing is it's no longer markets. It's a form of managed enclave economic activity, and it involves digital tools and techniques again. So you develop digital data analytic tools, algorithmic tools, in order to work out how to identify the precise interests and preferences of individuals, alongside identifying the precise price point at which they're willing to pay for those things. And that all seems like there's all this that seems like this scary surveillance capitalism, that Shoshana Zuboff notion of surveillance capitalism, that scary kind of idea that we're all going to be under the control of these kind of digital overseers, big tech, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. But I think that there's one of the problems with this, going back to what Flora said, one of the problems of this is that while you can, within this kind of digital economic perspective, while you can identify individual preferences, individual price points, and therefore you can have this kind of niche targeting of people. On the flip side of that, you can't. It's actually not really economically viable to do niche production yet. So you might be able to identify that this person loves yellow trainers that look like, that have really high heels, that have laces, that sparkle, all these sorts of things. But actually, you can't create that product for that individual as an individual product. So you're still left with mass production, essentially. And so you don't have niche production yet to fill in that kind of niche identification of preferences. And so you're still left with an issue in digital capitalism where you are still left with needing to identify the lowest common denominator in order to sell as many products or services as you can to as many people as you can.
Which is a very interesting aspect, by the way, these mass and power relationships. Also if we have let's call them these abstract economic spaces overtaking and shaping real spaces. And then in classical modernity, in the managerial capitalism, we had this mass production and these mass and power relations, and now we have them again, in fact, or we still have them. And I think we have also to consider the power of masses, which power, which in terms of influencing, even in terms of indirectly influencing, to generate new human beings via generating new self-understandings, this conditio humana thing we had, in which ways new masses, also digitalized masses, are exercising which kind of powers in the direction of transformation and reshape the human condition.
I think one of the really interesting things here is how systems and markets end up being designed around what we can measure. So taking into account these ideas of collecting data and using digital tools to design and sustain systems in a managed way for the masses, I'd be interested to know what happens in a slightly different context of measuring data that involves perhaps smaller groups of people. And Michael, you work in an academic setting at a university and work very closely with design and data collection. What's your opinion on this topic of measurement and how this system of designing around what we can measure, how does it play out in your work?
In my work at the university, there have over the years been an increase of administrative tasks to measure the quality of the work we are doing. Almost everything that can be measured will be measured. But in design education, there is a lot of tacit knowledge that does not lend itself well to simple models of measurement. A lot of things I do with the students are really hard to measure and capture in simple mathematical matrices. Therefore, all of those activities do not exist from the point of measurability, and therefore, from that point, hard to motivate. That is a kind of tyranny of the measurable. If it cannot be measured, it does not exist. I think that is a problem.
Yeah, and I think also coming back to what Kean was talking about with the algorithms, the social media, if we think about that as well, surely, truth becomes really important as well. Like if individuals don't tell the truth or people aren't honest and things are missed out of these algorithms, what's the implication for a society or a system that's not then built on, the full picture?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. This is really interesting around measurement and what can be measurable and so on. I think that this notion of this tyranny of the measurable that Michael raises is it leads to some interesting issues with the digital, as you mentioned, Flora. And I think that the way I've started to think about it is, rather than thinking about it in this kind of big brother watching us, surveillance capitalism, basically, that's like the kind of Foucauldian, Benthamite, panopticon. I'm trying to avoid thinking about it that way. This idea that data is, anyone who has access to our data essentially knows everything about us. And I think one of the important parts of this is the issue of reflexivity. So as humans, we are, we're highly reflexive beings in that we think about, we think about what other people think about us. If you see what I mean. So it's anybody who is trying to measure us will have difficulty, or anyone who's trying to collect data on us, it will have difficulty because the mere act of collection and measurement changes the way we act as a result. And so you're always facing off against this reflexive positioning, when you come to measurement, data collection, and so on. And it's that kind of, I think in physics it's the Heisenberg principle. Observing something changes it, and therefore your observation is no longer accurate. And I think the same very much applies here, where you collect data on people. People know you're collecting data on them. They don't always know what kind of data they're collecting about you, but they know you're collecting data. And people learn what is being collected, and they learn how to game the system. And so you end up with this. You end up with this situation in which you have an algorithmic system that you may think is impervious to, that is collecting the truth about the world, but actually it's responding to a series of reactions, self-aware, reflexive reactions of people in the world who want to change the way that others understand them. And that means that you constantly have to be aware of this gaming of the system, a gaming of capitalism even, and understand how it's managed, going back to, the management of this kind of space, managed spaces, how it's managed, and how it eventually will, I think, in almost every case, eventually it will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And we can, yeah.
Can I say two things? First, I also think it's interesting that we are by ourselves, through our activities online, creating an asset that has a value, but we ourselves do not own it. It's owned by others who own the algorithms and capture our imprints on the web. And that is a really strange business model. I think that I am the creator of the activity of this data, and therefore I shall own it. But I do not own it. Someone else does.
But that's a really interesting issue. Yeah, that's a really interesting in itself. And I've just done some work on this. How do we think about data as an asset? And what's really interesting is understanding that data, information about us, you cannot own that information per se. You can't own your name and require that other people pay you to use your name, because your name is a fact, the same as your address, right? So these things are facts, and so you can't go around claiming them as property. It'd be the same as trying to claim as property, gravity or something like that. This is the legal kind of delineation of these kinds of this kind of information. But what the companies, especially the big tech companies, so this is the research I've just been doing with some colleagues, what they are really interested in is they really want to know, first of all, how many and who their users are, right? So this is one of the key kind of metrics and measurements that they use to measure the value of themselves, is their number of users. It can be daily users, it can be monthly users. So these are two different measurement categories: daily users and monthly users. And it's also user engagement. So you have users on the one hand, but also the activities that the users do, which enables them to come up with some valuation of their platform or their digital product or service and so on. And so when it actually comes to understanding what the asset is here, it's a really interesting, even existential kind of issue, because it's not necessarily the information per se that is what they are calculating as the asset. It's literally us, right, and what we do that they are trying to set a boundary around. And to identify as this is the asset that we have. It's these people doing these things.
Yes, and this relates with my second thing. I was going to mention Michel de Certeau's idea about strategy and tactics. The companies have the strategy and the business model to mine our data, and we have let them, through the application we use, to capture all of the data points we create. If we then use tactics in the form of an algorithmical camouflage to obscure what we really do, so it looks that we behave in a certain way when we actually is doing something completely different.
Yes, I think so. I've actually suggested that it would be like I'm sure some people out there have created these sorts of things already. But if you wanted to disrupt this kind of digital capitalism model, some of the best ways of doing it would be to develop software that runs on your computer. Every time you use, you could use a non-Google product, but say you just want to keep using Google. So every time you run a Google search, the software automatically runs another 100 searches on your computer in another tab. So, and it just does this constantly. And the random searches, it just disrupting the information. The same could be, every time you shift, you click on a website, the software opens another random website. So you just go through this kind of process of generating data that Google is collecting, but it's just nonsense data. And you continue doing that through, with all your, whatever digital platform you're on, you just do that. You have a piece of software that just generates nonsense data that they are collecting, and they cannot disaggregate because there's no way for them to disaggregate. Maybe there is a way for them to disaggregate, but yeah, to my knowledge, not. Yeah.
In your eyes, Kean, what are the major consequences of these developments on human self-understanding and on the integrity of human beings? If we refer to discussions like real, unreal, already introduced by Baudrillard in the 60s as regards those processes.
Yeah, I think that often the impacts, effects, outcomes of this are not obvious right now, and I think that I think that sometimes it's unclear what will happen. So I think some of the things that I find problematic are the issue of data collection without collective consent. That's one thing. So I think that the European Union is doing a lot more on this to try and resolve this issue than places like Canada, the USA. So I think that there has to be a collective decision rather than an individual contractual, terms and license, terms and conditions tick box kind of thing that we all do when we sign up to a new application or something. We need a collective decision about whether we want our data to be collected or not, and then what kind of data would we allow, companies to collect, rather than it just being collect everything they want. But I think that has to be a collective political decision that gets made. A second kind of issue I think is around the it's kind of this the kind of this kind of relates to this political polarization that people are concerned about, where we are fed we are fed things that we want to read or align ourselves with, rather than encountering things that we disagree with. And I think this is a problem of enclaving, in that the internet has become a series of enclaves, and these are the digital platforms that we exist on. It could be Facebook, Instagram, whichever one we're using, TikTok now, and each of them has their own way of trying to get you to stay, keep your attention on it. And I think that enclaving is problematic politically, but it's also problematic economically, because it means that we end up, our economic lives end up being enclaved as well, and we end up being subject to the whim and the will of these large digital companies who run the game. They set the rules. They regulate, economic activity in the enclaves. Amazon, for example, or Apple, or Facebook. They set the rules of the game. And this is a problem, because you become subject to whatever their financial economic interests are. And this has come out in the US has had this congressional hearing about antitrust and big tech over the last year, and they've produced a 450-page report on the activities of big tech, and so it's all spelled out there. This is what they've been doing, and so I think that's going to become more and more problematic over time. And then I think the final one is to do with to what extent there is a divergence, if you like, between this representation of our digital selves and our kind of actual selves, and whether that's problematic, it has problematic psychological implications. And I don't know whether it does or not, but a lot of there's a growing difference between this our digital lives perhaps and our real lives, in the sense that our digital lives are places where we can present ourselves in certain ways that we may, in ways that we may want to be seen. And the real lives is kind of humdrum, a little bit humdrum and everyday, mundane. So I don't know whether that psychologically has a significant implications. People give a lot of flack to millennials, but I don't think I think that's unfair. I think it's unfair that there's all this kind of people talking about millennials in very disparaging ways, because I think that there's I don't think it's a kind of necessarily to do with they might be to do with growing up with the technology, but I think there are other things that we need to consider. But I don't, I'm not, I don't have that kind of insight.
We are talking on the one hand about managed spaces, okay, but on the other hand, more important, we are talking about our relevant lives we are leading today. And this is an important point. If we are considered with ideal spaces means with spaces in the direction of to change something, to make it more human again, and then all these issues have to be addressed.
The important bit is to think about, as Ulrich, you were saying, about the everyday nature of these changes. And I think that there's sometimes we can be, as an academic, I can fall into the trap of talking to other academics and thinking that is the be all and end all of my my work. But I think that there is it's more important to make sure that we are considering this everyday, the everyday, going back to the management aspect, the everyday management of our worlds, and how they are managed by different social actors, organizations, governments and so on. Yeah.
And it seems incredibly important that we consider all these different layers of management and how they connect with one another to get a really full picture, from the abstract digital collection of data to the community and right down to the individual. It leaves us with some very thought-provoking ideas on how the management of our world impacts lives and will continue to have an impact on people. As you say, Ulrich, it seems there's a lot of work to be done on how we can actually shift our mindset on management to favour the individual. Thank you so much, Kean, for joining us and sharing your research and perspective on managed spaces. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion and has really highlighted the complexities of the topic of management in terms of financial logics, the use of personal data, and of course how this might play out in the future. If you've enjoyed this podcast and are interested in finding out more about the topics we have discussed today, please do check out Kean Birch's new book, Assetization: Turning Things into Assets in Technoscientific Capitalism, which explores how things are controlled, traded, and capitalized as a revenue stream. It's co-edited with Fabian Munisa and published open access by MIT Press. Kean has also recently published a journal article on Automated Neoliberalism, the Digital Organization of Technoscientific Capitalism, published in the journal New Formations. Also on the topic of managed spaces are publications by Ulrich Giemann entitled Myths and Narratives for Management, which you can find on Academia and ResearchGate, and a co-written publication by Michael and Ulrich, Ideal Spaces Exhibition, written as part of the 6th EAI International Conference, Arts IT, Interactivity and Game Creation. The details of all 4 publications are included in the show notes below. To find out more about Ideal Spaces Working Group, please do check out our website idealspaces.org and Instagram page at idealspaceswg, where we upload new material and ideas every day. We will be continuing to talk about space in our next episode, which focuses in particular on functional spaces. Thank you for listening and see you next time.